Gentlemen, welcome to the Institute. My name is John Lanchowski. I'm president of the Institute, and it gives me a great pleasure to see so many students, alumni, faculty members, and other friends. And I'd like to, without further ado, introduce our speaker on Ukraine today, Dr. Marek Chodakiewicz. Marek is one of this country's foremost experts on the history of East Central Europe. He teaches here as a professor of history and holder of the Kosciuszko chair. He teaches courses on a wide variety of issues: strategic geography, modern political history, Western civilization and its intellectual tradition. He teaches a course on mass murder prevention in failed states. He teaches our courses on Russia. He could even teach a course on Japan if we wanted him to. He speaks numerous languages. He's one of the greatest miners of archival information out of the old communist archives. He has written numerous books, the most recent and relevant of which is Intermarium. It is on the history of the lands between the two seas, the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, which by and large represent the lands of the ancient multinational, multi-confessional Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in which Ukraine, or at least a good part of Ukraine, was a significant component. Marek has his PhD from Columbia University. He's taught at the University of Virginia, and in an earlier part of his life, he was a congenital rule breaker as a young teenage revolutionary in People's Poland. Anyway, Marek has escaped, maybe, so I can, so it's now time for you, yes. Now time for you to take the floor, and the floor is yours. So
thank you very much. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I've decided to run upstairs and show for my book, but I only have one copy, so I can send it around. If you get bored with my speech, lecture, you can look at it. It's the same thing. Well, not the same thing, but it's similar. I'm a historian. That means I would like to meet with you here in 20 years. Then I will tell you exactly what's happening right now. And I would be extremely solid, and I would pout if anybody disagreed. Unfortunately, we do not have that comfort, especially those of you who are in the government. We must operate in real time. And sometimes we see an elephant's trunk and we think it's a snake because a grove of acacia obscures the elephant. I would like to start with the fog of war. The fog of war is instant punditry. You open any newspaper or you flick through any channels on TV, you look at the internet, everybody now is a specialist on Ukraine. Hardly anybody says the Ukraine. They get it right, it's Ukraine. And they all pontificate. I don't know who really knows anything about Ukraine among that crowd, and I know it's a matter of national concern, so anybody can have an opinion. I always encourage people to read so that their opinion would be grounded in some facts at least. There is a lot of propaganda, there is a lot of obfuscation. It's the modern fog of war. If you can flick through it very quickly, that would be good.
That's much too fast.
Maybe we could read them.
Well,
Do you want to
go ahead.
people to absorb this?
Well, I would like people to have, I don't want people to absorb it. I will be making it available on our website. But basically, these are talking points that any pundit or talking head should internalize, and then she or he will sound smart without actually reading anything about Ukraine. So this is just a handy cheat sheet.
Go through the cheat sheet.
Okay. Sevastopol is of great strategic importance for Putin, especially given the ongoing situation in Syria. A useful ploy, this remark establishes you as a bigger picture guy who grasps the geopolitics of both Eastern Europe and the Middle East and that global multipolar world you were just talking about. What we are seeing here is the return of geography. Similar to the last, this one neatly lifts you away from the intricacies of Eastern European diplomacy and has the advantage of being almost completely meaningless. The similarities with Hitler and the Sudetenland, Auschwitz, Peter the Great, Stalin, and the Tatar Genghis Khan are striking. Historical analogies are invaluable to the experienced bluffer, but the amateur must tread carefully. It is terribly easy to become unstuck in the past. When in doubt, hedge. I am not saying that Putin is Hitler, but, or it's easy to get carried away with these comparisons, but try to look pained as if contemplating both the complexity and the imminent possibility of human suffering. Ukraine literally means borderland, of course. Easy one to remember, but a sentence that hints at real wisdom. It has the added benefit of not requiring any follow-up knowledge, used in the context of statelets, the great game, and annexation. I got it actually from Major Platt. Yes, but Putin is in danger of overplaying his hand, especially effective as a foil. If the clever bloke at the other end of the table is discussing an article he's read in Foreign Affairs, just wait for him to say anything about the limits of Western power and pounce. Replace the word Putin with NATO if he's going the other way. One must always be wary about unleashing ethno-nationalist forces. This one sets you up to make quite racist generalizations without seeming explicitly racist. The Slavs are at their most dangerous when national borders are in flux. You can add, having already dropped your ethnic sensitivity card. The Orthodox have a different way of looking at these things. Religion never fails when you need to generalize. Refer noddingly to the Moscow Patriarchate as if you expected all your companions to know the various traditions within Eastern Christianity. It all comes down to the energy markets. No one will dare contradict you here. Link the crisis to the shale gas revolution. Refer obliquely to the deals between the oligarchs, the Kremlin, and Gazprom, and throw in the words glasnost and perestroika, ideally in an ironically proficient Russian accent for good measure. I'm not sure we should be making light of the situation. We're talking about a potential World War III here. The Puritan's gambit. This establishes you as a serious dude who cares and silences those who might have been enjoying themselves too much. Send it as a reply to anyone who shares this post with you online. Which okay, that's it. Anyway, fog of war, instant punditry, they don't help in a crisis situation. And we're dealing with a crisis situation. I would love to tell you all about Ukrainian history from, say, 100,000 years ago, when Paleolithic culture first appeared on the shores of Black Sea, I would love to tell you about the Cimmerians, Scythians, then the Greek colonies, which eventually became subordinated to the Byzantines, who gave way to the Venetians and especially Genoans in the 13th century. And I haven't even started, but you ought to be aware that it's an ancient place. It has its tradition. From about the 5th, maybe, 6th century, Slavic people, some say earlier, others say later, the Slavic people who were the penultimate wave of Indo-Europeans to move into the old continent appeared there. That included Eastern Slavs, and among them the Rus or Ruthenians were the most assertive. Under the leadership of the Vikings, known as Varangians, they established a state, Kievan Rus. They interacted with the Byzantines. They were given a choice, for they were shopping around for a new religion, having apparently grown tired of the old pagan ways, both Slavic and Viking. The prince was given a choice: Latin Christendom, which was rather severe; Islam, which meant he could no longer drink; and Orthodoxy, which was resplendent in its Byzantine forms. So that's what Eastern Slavs elected, unlike Western Slavs. The Kievians and other Ruthenians oftentimes sojourned to the Black Sea, sometimes to trade, sometimes to fight. They occasionally visited the Crimean Peninsula, which used to be called Taurida. All those lands were called borderlands, as in the Ukraine. Once Ukraine became an independent state, we no longer referred to it, to the land by its geographic name. We call it Ukraine. That's the secret. The people now call themselves Ukrainians, but not all of them, most. There are also Russians, some Poles, Jews, Tatars, and actually almost everybody that had been captive in the Soviet Union, including Central Asians. They simply stayed there. And Armenians too, in both Western and Eastern Ukraine. Culture and religion of the place are Orthodox, Unate, Catholic, Jewish, and Muslim. The Uniates are Orthodox who recognize the Pope. They are in the union with Rome. They're not Catholics. Catholics are separate. Until recently, Catholicism was considered the Polish religion. Now there is an attempt by the Catholic Church of the former Soviet lands, in particular in Ukraine and Belarus, to go native. So it would no longer be associated with the former ruling class, with the nobility, which was ethnically mostly Ruthenian. So it's just a little factoid of history. Religion is not a dominant feature of the Ukrainian or people, citizens of Ukraine. They may adhere to a variety of faiths, some of them nominally, but I think the most important feature is self-identification. There are Russian-speaking people who identify themselves as Ukrainians because they live in Ukraine and they think they are Ukrainians. Therefore, they have a problem with people who tell them that they are not Ukrainians unless they speak Ukrainian. That has to be kept in mind. Now, Ukrainian nationalists, for obvious reasons, to compensate for horrible history, would like everybody to speak Ukrainian. But that's not going to happen anytime soon. It may happen in time if there is peace and stability. Otherwise, there will be troubles. Recent history of Ukraine, especially in the 20th century, in the first half of the 20th century, was extremely bloody and violent. First, we had a bid for independence in 1918 to more or less 1921. It failed. First, Ukraine emerged as a hetmanate or a puppet state of the Germans with Hetman Skoropadsky. Then eventually things unraveled and it traveled a bitter road between Makhno and Petlura. Makhno was an anarchist, extremely bloody, in the steppes of mostly eastern Ukraine, and Petlura was a populist nationalist leader, left wing, who attempted to maintain an independent state. He even made an alliance with Poland. The Poles, after defeating the Bolsheviks in the War of 1920, ditched the Ukrainians. There was, among many in Poland, especially with Marshal Piłsudski, there was a pro-Ukrainian sentiment and basically a Promethean movement in existence which aimed to liberate the people of the Soviet Union, in particular Ukrainians. There is a geopolitical school in Poland, active until this very day, that says there's no free Poland without free Ukraine and free everybody else, including the Armenians. At any rate, Ukrainians who were left under Polish rule thrived as far as their cultural and economic institutions were concerned, but educationally and politically they were suppressed, underprivileged, and occasionally violence was visited on them by the state. In response, and also as a function of their ideology, they became extremely radicalized. I'm talking about the most active among them. That led to acts of terrorism. Their guru was Dmitry Dontsov, who combined nationalism with paganism. One of the most extreme expressions of nationalism will be found in Dmitry Dontsov. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the situation progressed from Bolshevik Ukrainization of Central and Western Ukraine, Central and Eastern Ukraine, to forced collectivization and purges. We don't know how many died during terror famine. A legitimate figure is 2 million, another one is 6 million in Ukraine alone. The Ukrainians suffered also because of the geographic nature of their country, namely it was the steppes. When the collectivization was introduced in Belarus, you could run to the forest and eat berries. That was not an option in Soviet Ukraine. So the terror was compounded by the nature of the land. Millions died. During the Holodomor, the NKVD was also terrorizing whatever remained of Ukrainian elites, some of whom were Bolshevik, and some who pretended to be Bolshevik to save some residue of Ukrainian culture. Hundreds of thousands were shot in the second half of the 1930s in Ukraine. There are mass graves unearthed and crosses put on them, but only now, after Ukraine became independent. The hell of the 1930s was a prelude to the apocalypse of the Second World War. And the Second World War started with a joint attack by Hitler and Stalin on Poland in September 1939. Western Ukraine was absorbed in the Soviet Union. The Soviets deported and exterminated broadly understood Polish elite. For instance, if you were an Orthodox Ukrainian village levy, you would be considered a Polish official and deported or shot, depending on the paragraph that the NKVD liked to use against you. There was terror and economic exploitation. It went in waves, first ethnic Poles, then refugees who were mostly Jewish, refugees from Hitler. They were sent to the Gulag, then Ukrainian nationalists. There was a wave of shooting as the Soviets were retreating because Beria issued an order, shoot all the counter-revolutionary elements, meaning everybody who was in Soviet jail should not be abandoned to the enemy as Hitler attacked east. No wonder that very many Ukrainians welcomed the Germans with flowers. They didn't think anything could get any worse. And at first, Ukrainian nationalist orientation split into two options. One was, both were for Ukrainian nationalism and both wanted to have a Ukrainian state. But one decided to collaborate with the Nazis. That was the Melnik Orientation. And the other, after a brief romance with the Nazis, who failed to give Ukrainians much, except for some cultural freedoms, Bandera refused to collaborate and he was put in a concentration camp. His people either joined the Nazi police force as SS Hilfswillige, or went underground. There was some Ukrainian nationalist participation in the Holocaust, just like there had been some Ukrainian nationalist participation in the Soviet secret police to get the Poles. That only makes sense. After the Holocaust, some Ukrainian nationalist leaders decided that it was a fantastic way to get rid of an unwanted nationality, and in 1943 they launched an ethnic cleansing campaign which verged on genocide in some places, and about 120,000 Poles in Volhynia and elsewhere were slaughtered. This was during World War II. The Germans did not control the countryside. The entire Ukrainian police force, collaborationist police force of the Nazis, deserted in March 1943 in the province of Volhynia and joined the Ukrainian underground and launched its attacks on the Polish population. For Ukrainian nationalists, more or less, there were three enemies: Poles, Soviets, and Germans. The Germans were the least dangerous, especially when the Germans started losing and retreating. Hence, when the Germans called for assistance, about 40,000 people volunteered in 2 days or 3 days to join the 14th Waffen-SS Galician Division. Once again, it was not done for Hitler. Ukrainian nationalists thought that was the best way to establish their own fighting force. The UPA occasionally engaged the Germans, but mostly the Ukrainian insurgent army mostly busied itself with ethnic cleansing of the Poles, fighting the Soviets, as well as assassinating Ukrainians who were considered either communists or of assistance to the Polish population. Then the Red Army came, and the peace of the grave and the peace of prison prevailed in the Ukrainian lands. There were mass shootings of anybody who was suspected of anything. The NKVD troikas started on the so-called liberated territories, killing anybody. If you ever delivered food to the Germans, because there was a forced food quota, you'd be tagged a collaborator and hanged publicly. If you continued from Soviet times as a village administrator, that made you a Nazi collaborator. You'd be killed. One of KGB defectors, General Mitrokhin, started his career as a member of the Troika in Ukraine. First in the Soviet part and then in the former Polish part. There was blood everywhere, and on top of it, expulsions and so-called population exchanges. The Poles were cleansed almost entirely, especially from Western Ukraine. And some Ukrainians were brought in. Original Jews disappeared because of the Holocaust, almost everybody, Jewish. They were all exterminated. Some Soviet Jews moved in afterwards, as did other Soviet citizens. Lots of Poles came back to central Ukraine, to where they had been deported from during the so-called Gulag and Polish operation of the NKVD in the 1930s. So after 1956, many came back from Kazakhstan or the Gulag. Hence, there are very many minorities still in Ukraine. Between 1944 and 1990, the people of Ukraine experienced re-Sovietization with all its gore and propaganda. Things calmed down after Stalin died, in particular after 1956. Mass terror was suspended. The last Ukrainian anti-communist insurgent emerged from hiding in 1992. He had been hiding in his sister's attic. I'm not mocking at all, because last units were destroyed in the field in the 1950s. When you go to the Gorgana chain of the Carpathians, there are little kurhani, which are little graves with crosses, and it says here 3 Ukrainian insurgent army fighters fell in battle with the NKVD. And this dots the countryside now. The Ukrainians have begun to remember because they are now free to remember. It all had been suppressed. Ukraine proclaimed its independence. There was a referendum. Over 90% voted for free Ukraine. That includes Russian speakers, Russians, Armenians, Poles, everybody, Jews, over 90% when the Soviet Union was imploding. Over 90% did not want to be associated with the Soviet Union, did not want to be associated in a state organism of an emerging Russian Federation. There were naturally a variety of problems from the beginning. For instance, the Crimean Peninsula demanded autonomy. The situation was very tense, but it received its own parliament. Most in the the Crimean Peninsula are Russian speakers, but there are very many Tatars too, who had been the original denizens, and they were deported to Siberia by Stalin, to the Gulag. They eventually, many of them returned, only to find themselves dispossessed because new people moved into their homes. But for the most part, there have been some altercations in the past 20 years. There were some problems, but for the most part, things worked out all right. There was some kind of compromise, some kind of concord, and it prevailed everywhere. If you visited Ukraine in the 90s and in the 21st century, most people griped about oligarchs and kleptocrats. I was passing by a neighborhood of very California-looking houses. And the cabbie who took me there, I said, "Oh, wory w zakonie," meaning thieves-in-law, made thieves, like mafia. And he said, "Yeah, but they're now legalized." Almost everybody would gripe, and most people, when griping, would assume it was a permanent feature of a system that applies everywhere in the post-Soviet zone, including the former Warsaw Pact countries, namely post-communism. I always do an exercise for my students. Communism, transformation, not democracy. Post-communism. An object does not change its characteristics and qualities, it just changes its shape. If you keep the old people in power everywhere, in the banks, secret police, armed forces, it is not a democracy. They may pretend to go through democratic motions because you don't have money to print your own posters when you're running for office, and by the way, Goblin will come and beat the bejesus out of you. Do you know who Goblin is? That's the pseudonym of the guy who's just been elected president of Crimea. He was with the mafia, I hear, in the 1990s, but now he's the president. Anyway, the people know that, and that they become very embittered and cynical about democracy, about freedom, because they think that's freedom to cheat, steal. That's freedom for arbitrary behavior. We had a student here who was a Russophone. Her father was a Red Army colonel. She was from Dniepropetrovsk, I think, if I remember correctly. Unfortunately, because she was rather attractive, she attracted unwanted attention of Ramat Akhmetov, one of the richest men in the world, a steel magnate who used to be a boxer in a KGB club. And then he appropriated most of Ukraine's steel industry because he was a boxer in a right club. Sports clubs are very important. He tried to snatch her. First thing he did was build himself a villa in the middle of the city's Central Park. Imagine somebody building a palace in the middle of New York Central Park, and then he built a fence so nobody could enter the park anymore. And the city council voted in favor. Okay. This was the norm almost everywhere. Hence, the Orange Revolution. It was an Orange Rebellion, non-violent for the most part. The people showed up and overthrew, Viktor Yanukovych. There were demonstrations, pageantry, singing. And the people thought everything would be fixed. Well, nothing was, because the elites are very similar, whether they are anti-Eastern or anti-Western. They are the same post-Soviet elites, most of them extremely corrupt. So the advent of Yushchenko simply meant the disintegration of the Orange Coalition, awful quarreling over the spoils, lack of concord, or any strategic plan for Ukraine. Just everything went to pieces. So in 2010, Yanukovych and his orientation returned to power. One of the greatest achievements, to be fair, of the Yushchenko period was that Holodomor became well-known terror famine throughout Ukraine. Before, it had been mostly, the knowledge had been mostly limited to scholars, some of the survivors who didn't like to talk about it much. He made it a national tragedy. It was great because it united Ukrainian-speaking West with the Russian-speaking East, because it was the East and the center that suffered, because Western Ukrainians were in Poland. The Poles didn't believe in collectivizing anything. For the first time, Ukraine had a discourse and narrative in common. Holodomor, terror famine. It was also good because for the first time, an alternative narrative emerged to both the anarchist, ultranationalist narrative and the communist narrative, which were all the same. Who are the enemies of Ukraine? The Polish lords. In 2010, when I was hiking in the Carpathians, I saw a number of training camps for Ukrainian nationalist kids. And when the kids were passing us, they were teenagers and in their 20s, they would sing, "We shall never give Ukraine back to Poland." Okay, thank you. Last time I remember, the Ruthenians, including my family, went to Poland to be a part of the West. But it was 500 years ago, and only I have elephantine memory, as far as that is concerned. They also gave us water because we had been hiking and ran out of water, so they shared water, even though we're Polish lords. Anyway, so terror famine, the memory of terror famine, and symbolism, for the first time, united all in misery. Naturally, the way it was translated offended Moscow, but at least there was something. When Yanukovych and the Legionnaires returned, they simply continued what their predecessors did, so there was more kleptocratic and oligarchic rule. And the people thought that nothing changes. There is a proverb: the pigs change, the Thoreau stays the same. So everybody, if you're in the elite, political elite, you steal. That's how you make yourself rich. There is no other way but through crony connections, through, I guess, crony capitalism, political capitalism. No other way. However, when Yanukovych ascended, he began experimenting with increasing presidential power. So he started to resemble Lukashenko next door in Belarus. A little bit of Putin. It was not excessive, but by post-Soviet standards, because if you think that somehow Yanukovych was Hitler, then I'll take you to Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan. then you'll understand that by post-Soviet standards, Yanukovych was mild. This is not my praise of him. I'm simply contextualizing. But Yanukovych insisted on doing this in Russian, which mobilized the most mobilized part of the state, Ukrainian nationalists, who became livid. They saw, or they perceived Yanukovych's moves as far as the Russian language is concerned as the first step to dismantling Ukraine. They were already mobilized, everything was seething, and they were the first to oppose. But the president controlled the parliament, and his party did, so they could vote anything they wanted. Why? Because they had won democratic elections. Were the elections pretty? No, there was cheating, but not overwhelming cheating. I wouldn't say respectable, but more or less the elections passed the smell test. They smelled bad, but they weren't rotten. Which is a lot to be said again in the post-Soviet zone. I will talk about the overthrow or Euro-Maidan era from November 2013 and to February 2014 next, and I've brought up the democratic elections because it's relevant. For now, we'll be talking about legitimacy. How legitimate was the Ukrainian government? Well, it was elected democratically, legitimately. The party of the regions won. Yanukovych became president, but he lost the mandate of heaven because he violated democratically the constitution, voting himself extraordinary powers. So demonstrations ensued. Were they legitimate? If Ukraine claims that it's a democracy, demonstrations or the citizens taking to the streets is absolutely legitimate. Absolutely legitimate. In Hungary, there were massive riots against the communists or post-communists. The government quit, there were elections, and an unprecedented 70% of the electorate voted for the center-right. So the Reds and the Pinks have nothing to say in the new Parliament of Hungary. We consider this legitimate, you see, even though there were massive and violent demonstrations against the post-communist government in Budapest and elsewhere throughout Hungary. Then there were elections and everything was hunky-dory. In Bulgaria, a few years ago, there were also massive riots. The government quit, and then there were elections. And the people re-elected the same people to be the government. Because those who are most active in the streets are not necessarily those who show up at the polls in numbers. But once again, in Bulgaria, the government was overthrown or quit, resigned, because of massive civil disobedience. So it is democratic, so long as there are elections afterwards. Therefore, what has happened so far on the Maidan in Kiev is legitimate. It is legitimate for citizens to express their anger with the government, so long as democratic procedures are kept, and we are promised that there will be an election, right? Right? Okay. Now, what was the nature of the rebellion? Because the engine undoubtedly was one: nationalism. Well, let me tell you something. They are all nationalists because they're simply patriots who care about their country. Nationalists with a lowercase n. In the Western sense, especially American sense, we always say nationalism when we mean patriotism. In Europe, they are afraid of the word nationalism because it invokes chauvinism. The greatest orgy of nationalism I've ever witnessed in the United States was when we defeated the Soviet hockey team in 1980. So Americans, when they hear nationalism, shrug. Yeah, it's great. That's the spirit. However, in Ukraine and elsewhere in Europe, as well as in Russia, in the Russian Federation, nationalism has a bad name attached to it for a variety of reasons. Number one, it's the legacy of World War II. And number two, it's communist propaganda. The nationalists were their greatest opponents and competition. So the communists did everything they could to besmirch the love of one's country. Tagging as nationalism understood as chauvinism and genocide, any reflex that leads a people to express national interests that would be inimical to the communists, post-communists, and Moscow in particular. If you disagree with the Kremlin, you must be a fascist. Anyway, we'll talk about propaganda in a second. So, what was the nature of Euromaidan? Was it a coup d'etat, like Putin said? Was it a revolution, counter-revolution? Some of the Pravi sector, the right sector, one of the groups said, this is the beginning of a Europe-wide counter-revolution. Woohoo! I said, but I really don't know what they meant by it. So before I rejoice, I would like to test it and research it. But we don't have 20 years, once again. Was it anarchy, the so-called chern? Well, was it a rebellion against post-communism? And that's why, for instance, old top orange rebellion leaders are not that popular. For instance, Julia Tymoshenko was not exactly French-kissed by the demonstrators when she emerged from jail. They booed her, the former prime minister and the leader of Fatherland Party or Baktiyvshchizna Party. At any rate, we have to keep this in mind. We can quarrel what it was, what actually transpired on the Maidan, but I think there were parts of all those phenomena involved. The coup d'etat, anarchy, counter-revolution, revolution, rebellion. In general, the people were angry, and I'll discuss this in a second. The participants. So let's look at the Maidan demonstration. Who were the participants? Well, according to Moscow and key official Kiev, at least under Yanukovych, the participants were Jews and neo-Nazis. When Moscow aimed its propaganda, and I'll discuss it in a second, when Moscow aimed its propaganda against, or beamed its propaganda to the West, the Kremlin always complains about neo-Nazis in Kiev. When the propaganda was beamed domestically, it was the Jews behind the demonstration. Okay, so the elders of Zion manipulating Nazis. Great conspiracy, but that's what it adds up to. If you watch Russia's TV, they stream it live, you can get clips on YouTube, etc. That is the narrative for domestic consumption. From my point of view, initially it was what Americans referred to as the kids, meaning students or student wannabes who have a lot of time on their hands because they don't work. Those people from as far as their political orientation, and so far as any of them have any political orientation, it verges between anarchists to ultranationalists. Those were the students on Maidan. So anybody was there. They mobilized through social media, text messages. There's one story that an Afghan who became a Ukrainian citizen, an Afghan journalist, was texting friends, and they all went on Twitter, and a lot of activists and others showed up. There are there were at least initially NGO activists. Sometimes they were Western funded, often with a leftist slant. There were no bare-breasted feminist activists, simply because it was too cold. But some of their associates were there. The feminine ladies perform in the West because it's much more lucrative, and then they become world famous. But people like this showed up at first. All angry at the oligarchs, kleptocrats, post-communism, and what have you. I don't think there was a single agenda. Everybody had a gripe. If I were there, I'd say my shoes didn't fit. So that was a reason good enough. That's how it happens, usually. It was non-violent. Something was going on. The kids are idealistic. I've seen it a number of times in a number of places, including very much in Central and Eastern Europe. Who else showed up? A very important constituency. I told you when I was in the Carpathians in 2010, I saw nationalist kids training. The trainers usually wore some kind of makeshift uniform. Oftentimes, or a few of them had striped shirts, which meant they had been in the Spetsnaz. And the trainers were my age, so they were about 50 years old. Almost with no exception, the people who took care of the kids, of the teenagers and people in their early 20s, with almost no exception, they were Red Army veterans, Afghanci. That means Afghan war participants. That's who trained. A very important constituency. They did not become active on the Maidan until violence occurred, but they were there. Next, we have the ultra-nationalists. As I said, everybody is a nationalist, but the ultra-nationalists were not highly visible. They were there on the Maidan. And soccer hooligans. In fact, the Pravi sector or right sector party, most likely, its name most likely comes from a sector of a football stadium. The right sector. And I could see, when you observe pictures, when you look at pictures very closely, some of them have soccer club insignia on them. So you can tell them apart. You had Svoboda, which used to be called Socialist, Nationalist Party, or Nazis, neo-Nazis. In the 1990s now, they calmed down a little bit. They're still ultra-nationalists. You had more mainstream radical nationalist organization of Ukrainian nationalists. Hence when Putin says that everybody on Maidan is a neo-Nazi, that's what he means. A section is a section of the people who were among the demonstrators and who were very visible were of that orientation. Then we have Cossacks. They're anti-communist Cossacks. And usually they speak Ukrainian. This includes a Jewish sotnya. Sotnya means 100. That's a Cossack cavalry unit. They were Jews against the post-communists. Okay. You had other minorities like Tatars. The Tatars showed up. By the way, all those minorities also surfaced in post-communist demonstrations throughout Ukraine, including even in Donetsk. I was shocked because sometime in January, 500 people marched in Donetsk against the post-communists and against Viktor Yanukovych. Completely strange. That there were counter-demonstrators too, I'll tell you. Last but not least, on the Maidan, there were political leaders with and without followers. One of the most prominent ones, most prominent ones was Vitaly Klitschko, a boxer. His father was a Red Army general. His party Udar is popular in the east and in the center. It's too moderate for the West. Udar, by the way, well, is supported by Germany. Okay, let's look at demonstrating and fighting. First of all, things were great. There were church leaders too, and priests as chaplains during the demonstrations. But I am a great fan of non-violence. Not because I'm a pacifist. Those people who tell you that violence doesn't solve anything, well, have them talk to Adolf Hitler. Violence did solve our problem with Adolf Hitler. So occasionally, we need to help some people go away, because they won't go away on their own, like Adolf Hitler. I'm sorry, but that's just how it is. But I said occasionally in extremis. At first it was non-violent. There was a great deal of pageantry, festival, lightning, fireworks. By the way, it continued until the end. Sometimes I thought to myself, gee, TV cameras must be thrilled because it always looks like huge portions of the Maidan are lit up. And I was thinking, well, maybe there were eternal flames with gas. Maybe that's what they lit up. I don't know, but it was highly visible, which for me was highly unusual. If I were the authorities, I'd cut that gas off so nobody could see anything, but that's not what happened. Now, by this I don't mean a plot. Oftentimes in the post-Soviet zone, things are extremely unprofessional. What in the West would never pass may be the norm. For instance, one time I was on a plane, it caught on fire, and I was the only person who worried. Then the stewardess said, some oil fell on the engine. It was a propeller plane. It'll burn itself out. I said, there's smoke coming into the cabin. Shouldn't we, sort of know? It's okay. Anyway, I was luckier than the passengers of this was a propeller plane, Aeroflot. But I was luckier than the passengers of a jumbo jet that flew over Kazakhstan from, I think, flying to Moscow. The pilot got drunk and gave his 10-year-old son a shot. And the kid didn't really excel. The whole thing went down. But we had the black box, so we know what happened. Anyway, so when I say that there were certain things that didn't make sense from the point of view of the authorities, crowd control, etc., I mean they didn't necessarily have to be professional. That's all. One of the greatest things that happened on Maidan was what had not happened during Orange Revolution, and I was really mad at that time at the Ukrainian people. They left Lenin standing. Now they didn't make that mistake. We have a map, yes. Okay. Please note on the map, once Lenin went down in Kiev, there was a slaughter of Lenins everywhere in central Ukraine, in the areas roughly coinciding to the borders of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. However, some Lenins went down in eastern Ukraine. Very unusual. Very unusual, but they did. And it was wonderful for me.
So it only happens now, this year?
Yes. Now, during Euromaidan. Yes. You see nothing, almost nothing happened in the east. Do you know why? I mean, nothing happened in the west. Do you know why? Because the Ukrainian nationalists in the west exterminated almost all the Lenins previously. It's now the central Ukrainians and southern Ukrainians and a bit to the east that are beginning to decommunize symbols. And that's very important. In the west, there hardly were any left after 20 years. But now it turns out that the people began associating misery with communism 20 years later, and Lenin, and totalitarianism, and Holodomor. This is all, especially in the east and center east and south, all spontaneous. Because elsewhere you could envision a crew of Ukrainian nationalists from the west coming with a truck and talking to the townies and overturning Lenin. No, in most places they just exterminated Lenins on their little selves. And that is empowerment of the people. That means they're no longer afraid. It's taken 20 years in the old Soviet Union. What's the difference? Well, Western Ukraine was Poland when the terror was at its height. Central and Eastern Ukraine were the Soviet Union. The trauma is so deep that people don't tell their children or grandchildren anything. Sometimes they would speak more gladly to me and chase their kids away, because the memory of the terror lingers horribly. That's warm fuzzy. Lenin. I should have sent Mr. Stern, who's done a fantastic job, a picture of an aerial picture of a truck with Lenin inside being hauled off to Seattle. Yes, and I don't know if you realize that, but there's some totalitarian-minded citizens of Seattle bought themselves a Lenin from a scrap heap of history and mounted it in Seattle. I'm waiting for their friends to mount Adolf Hitler or something like this, and it'll be just lovely. I don't understand why it's still standing and the citizens of Seattle don't care. At any rate, after the attacks on Lenin, Berkut attacked. Berkut was the special police, assault police, riot police. This was a huge mistake. A festival was interrupted. A festival which of Ukrainian nationalism, a festival which would have proceeded along Orange Revolution lines. The Berkut people made a mistake. They picked the wrong tents. Why? Well, students, especially those from Kiev, have families in Kiev, and they have dorms. So they would rotate in their tents. Ukrainian nationalists, in particular from the West, didn't have dorms in Kiev. There wasn't enough space, and they gladly camped out. It's not strange And everybody practices tent cities during protest in those parts of the world. I'll tell you one story. When, after the Orange Revolution, Ukrainian nationalists realized that they had made a colossal mistake for not overturning Lenin, they attempted to do so. And there were riots because the communists showed up. The government backed away, so Ukrainian nationalists did not have any support in their endeavor to take Lenin down in 2005 or so. And the communists, to protect Lenin from being blown up, because the Ukrainian nationalists tried to do it, built a tent city around Lenin. And there were about 100, between 20 and 100 communists, depending on the time, guarding Lenin around the clock, 24/7. I saw them from 2005 to 2000, I think, 11 in Kiev, guarding Lenin. They were living on Euromaidan, it's just there weren't 40,000 of them. So Berkut made a huge mistake. Berkut thought that it was going to go after bespectacled nerds, leftist sandalista NGO, funded kids, Mother Earth types. Sorry. One feature of Ukrainian ultra-nationalism is that they like to work out. And the Berkut was routed. This would be the equivalent of Occupy Wall Street beating up Navy SEALs. Once violence occurred, the spiral of hatred and action began overwhelming everyone. And now the beefcakes said to the kids, "Yo, stand behind me." This is why the most highly visible groups, here I'll show you, no, I don't have my phone with me, but some of the most visible groups on the Euromaidan were extremists. Ultranationalists, soccer hooligans, neo-Nazis, fascists, you name them. Yes, they captured a Cossack. The special police captured a Cossack, stripped him and beat him up. And they filmed it and posted on YouTube. They thought it would be good propaganda for them. Violence increased. The ultranationalists were radicalized because their paranoia increased. The police undertook very, very radical measures to dislodge them. We witnessed medieval tactics, people basically building Roman-like formations, the scuda, the turtle, and clashing with the police. And guess what? The police and the military, unless they are special forces, in the post-Soviet zone, tend to represent an average citizen. An average citizen is undernourished. There is no esprit de corps except for special forces. So the ultranationalists, soccer hooligans and others held their own. Now Putin alleged that since the demonstrators were so successful, that was because the Poles and Lithuanians trained them. Well, as I told you before, I saw training camps and small groups in the Carpathians, and I saw the Afghans. In 20 years, I'll tell you if the Poles or Lithuanians trained them, but I doubt it. This is what American and other Western press misses completely. When Putin spoke, he blamed the troubles on the Poles. That has to do with a complex over the Polish lords, historical complex, a complex over the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was the only successful alternative to unite the Intermarium, meaning the land between the Black and Baltic seas, in some kind of a just commonwealth. This was in early modern period, about 500 years ago. But to mobilize Russian nationalism, you do well to invoke the Poles. And this is not a joke. If you look at Politburo records, until the mid-30s, in secret, Stalin constantly and his comrades griped about the Poles. They thought that Great Britain was the greatest power, global power, but the greatest threat to the Soviet Union was from Poland, puny Poland. They couldn't match up. They complained about the Japanese on the other side, but not as often as the Poles. They were afraid of the Japanese, but they really were paranoid that Poland was going to attack. This Czechist tradition of paranoia persists, and it's very useful for Russian propaganda. The West misses it completely because, well, Poland doesn't matter. It's a small, weak country, which is true, but not for Putin. It is a weak country, but it's a fantastic mobilizing tool for Russian nationalism. At any rate, it was obvious that Yanukovych was going to crack down seriously. The authorities were unable to contain the demonstrators. There was a stalemate with riot police tactics not working out, faced by medieval combatants fighting in disciplined formations and being very strong. By the way, if any of you are surprised about the ultranationalists, then you should have watched Ukrainian TV a year, 2 years ago, after the elections of 2010. Svoboda, or Freedom Party deputies, would stand up, even though there were only 19 of them, would stand up to 80, 90 Party of the Regions people, Legionnaires, the people of Viktor Yanukovych. Why? Because previously the Legionnaires would beat up any deputy who annoyed them. The beefy guys, fat with beer bellies. And then they faced the ultranationalists who fought back and beat them, outnumbered 1-4. So, not that this is so unusual. If you look at Taiwan's parliament or South Korea's parliament, sometimes they beat each other up. But here it was very unusual because for the first time somebody in the parliament stood up to the post-communists. And those were ultranationalist thugs. They were very happy. And then they were very happy performing on the Euromaidan. Only Western pundits were surprised. At any rate, it really appeared at the end of February that the authorities were going to crack down violently. The stalemate could not continue. It was very obvious. There was a compromise with Yanukovych and the opposition brokered on February 21st. Radek Sikorski was behind the compromise. He was convinced that the demonstrators would be crushed. There would be martial law and a bloodbath, because that's what Yanukovych was preparing. So Radek had intel. Ukrainian nationalists with a smaller case N thought that he was horrible, that this was completely unwarranted, where, as it turned out, very soon after the agreement, Yanukovych fled. But why? First, what happened was snipers appeared. There was tactical and strategic shooting of, these are actual pictures of the people, tactical and strategic shooting of demonstration leaders. That's what we do in the West. we shoot. If things are out of control, we shoot at leaders. Here is a problem. If you march in at a Skuda or phalanx formation and your face is covered, you cannot tell who the leaders are. Number one. Number two, if you march in at a Skuda formation, everybody in the phalanx, as you know, is equal, because that was the Greek way. You cannot tell who's giving orders. The snipers shot, sometimes tactically, they shot people, and sometimes they shot people randomly. Masked people in the back of the head, people who were having soup. Putin said they were not Ukrainian commandos. He called them provocateurs. But they only shot 2 or 3 score of people, including militiamen, for they were firing randomly. Snipers don't make mistakes like this. Had they killed 1,000 people, the demonstration would have dispersed. But they only shot 2 or 3 scores of people, which enraged the demonstrators even more. Once again, Putin called them provocateurs. Dr. Olga Bogomil, who is what is called the social or NGO side of the demonstrations, suggested to the EU's foreign minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Estonia that the snipers were sent by the anti-Yanukovych camp to further enrage the crowds. Well, I have news for her. An old NATO ally, military intelligence facial recognition software indicates that the snipers were FSB crack team from Moscow. Do I have proof? Oh yes, I talked to, and I know nobody will go on the record. Have I bragged that I don't have a security clearance? That's why we can meet and talk about those things. I'm not dotting an I, I'm just telling you that because I'm a historian, I'd like to meet with you in 20 years. Right now, I'm only giving you the scoop that I have. Once again, a doctor, Olga Bogomolets. Olga Bogomolets said that the slugs were the same, taken out of the bodies of policemen and demonstrators. Putin says they were provocateurs and admits they were not Ukrainian snipers. And then an old, not the Poles, old NATO ally used facial recognition because some of them made a mistake of unveiling. And the old ally has a database. Okay, which means we know nothing. And we were only following orders. What were the snipers all about? Well, one of the parliamentary deputies has posted a bunch of documents. I don't know whether they are false or not, but for the record, Yanukovych prepared something called Operation Wave. Fala. Operation Wave aimed to take over all TV and radio stations, chase the Maidan demonstrators into a trap, I guess a cul-de-sac, and dispose of them, neutralize them. That's what the documents say. And the documents also say special forces were to concentrate on the right sector, Pravi sector, because nobody could take Pravi sector out of the regular or irregular police or any other formation. So Ukraine's special forces were to hit the right sector. Unfortunately for Yanukovych, the police and the military went on Italian strike. That is, very few fulfilled the orders. So nothing happened. That's why he fled. This was the showdown, and the showdown didn't happen. Now this is very important. They did not join the demonstrators, I stress. It was an Italian strike. That means the military brass did not want to have anything to do with a bloodbath. Or maybe it means they were just typical passive post-Soviets and didn't want to get involved because. Be that as it may, Italian strike completely undermined the government's attempt to solve the situation, solve forcibly. It's supposed to be called Operation Wave. Am I going to give you my left hand? No, not even a finger. Because I only have one source, an angry legislator in Kiev. In 20 years, we can talk shop. Right now, I'm indicating a very real possibility that I think very feasible, because if I were Yanukovych, I'd like peace. And I'd like to enjoy my girlfriend who is a spa owner. But anyway, that's just Yanukovych, not me. And who likes apparently Pomeranian Spitzes. Remember that footage of Yanukovych leaving his dacha with, that was not his dog, that was his girlfriend's dog. Random things I find out about. What about the aftermath? Well, Yanukovych flees, but unfortunately he refuses to concede. Following Orange Revolution, he pouted, withdrew to the bowels of his feudal fief in eastern Ukraine, but he conceded. Now, no. He considers him still a president. First he was hiding in Ukraine, then he went into exile in Russia. His next move is really predicated on the Kremlin, which on the one hand disavowed him, and on the other hand has kept him in reserve, which is smart. That's what you would expect of the masters of intrigue in Moscow. A new government was formed. This is a coalition, a narrow coalition, because it's a temporary government until the elections, derived from former opposition political parties led by, by the Fatherland Party, which is Baktivshizna, which is Yulia Tymoshenko's party. Western observers tend to call them moderately nationalists. They are a party of business, as usual, with some nationalism in it, hence Yulia dressing up her hair like a typical 19th century Ukrainian peasant, to be more folksy. I guess I would call them populist or populist veneer, but it's business as usual. There are some kleptocrats there. For instance, when you see how the regional governorships were handed out, there are two very worrisome people, Serhiy Taruta in Donetsk and Ihor Kolomoisky in Dnipropetrovsk. One is a steel magnate, a kleptocrat, and the other one is a banker, a kleptocrat too. It's not good news because it feeds into the Kremlin propaganda. Putin himself, in a speech, angry speech, this is the first time Putin got mad, said, well, they replaced one set of crooks with another. And in some cases, unfortunately, that is correct. The coalition government includes the ultra-nationalist Svoboda, Freedom Party. I know, hey. the number of portfolios allocated to Svoboda and positions is well above the party's electoral strength in Ukraine, and it reflects a leading role in the Maidan movement. But they are not in control. That will cause problems, for they think that they won a revolution or a counter-revolution. And sad news is that the centrist, for all it's worth, centrist, another party, which in the West is identified as Christian Democrat, and that's just mirror imaging, and that is not Christian Democrat, but the centrist Udar of Klitschko refused to join the government. That's bad news, because Klitschko is popular in the East and his party, not only in the center. Bad news. Okay. The Ukrainian government under Arseniy Yatsenyuk de-escalates. It issued orders not to fire against the Russian troops, except in Belbek near Sevastopol. A Ukrainian sentry discharged his gun after Russian troops had thrown stun grenades, maybe as a joke, at Ukrainian soldiers. Yes, they're very crude in certain places, so I wouldn't be surprised, but there is no blood. The Ukrainian government called up some reserves, but there is no hysteria, no universal mobilization. Kyiv counts on a diplomatic solution achieved by the West. And very importantly, the government has begun to reassure the Russian speakers wary of Ukrainian integral nationalism by promising to veto the anti-Russian language legislation, which was introduced immediately after the victory to smear Yanukovych's face. This was a symbol, a very silly timing, sort of like the Estonians dismantling the unknown rapist sculpture of the Soviet soldier in Tallinn right before the anniversary of the end of World War II. Bad timing. Those things can wait and be resolved differently. Very quickly, as we have to end, domestic censorship doesn't like my talking. Let's have a look at anti-Maidan counter-demonstrations. The regions involved are the Crimea, eastern and southeastern Ukraine. The factors in the anti-Maidan demonstrations, by the way, they call themselves anti-Maidan oftentimes. The factors are pro-Yanukovych legitimacy, but it has lost strength. Pro-Ukraine, so the other patriotism for not from the West. They wave Ukrainian flags from time to time. The Russian flags have been gaining prominence, but initially it was both. And there is the pro-Russian factor, Russian flags and claims we are Russians. That's the case in Donetsk. The demonstrators took over the government building in Donetsk, and they have hoisted Russian flags, not Ukrainian flags. And there is more than a whiff. There is a great deal of Stalin nostalgia for the Soviet Union. Some even display pictures of Stalin. So who participates? Mostly Russophone population. Local militias, fighting groups, including martial arts clubs. Oh yes, this is a typical FSB provocation. This woman showed up everywhere. She is, can you read it? Because I don't want to leave the microphone. She's from
one is
Mothers, yes.
Then another one is Anti-Maidan. Third one is Kiev woman. Then you have Kharkiv woman, and at the bottom is Odessa woman.
That's on Russian TV. She's the generic woman who shows up in various places.
Looks like the same woman.
This is my point. It's the same woman. This is an FSB provocation. She's on TV in various places pretending to be someone else.
It's probably like the actors that are hired for anti-Affordable Care Acts.
Madam, spies are always the best actors. They always have to pretend. So we have Spetsnaz in unmarked uniforms, especially in Crimea. We have Cossacks, pro-Russian Cossacks. I think Mr. Stern has already shown it to us. And we have the mafia, apparently, since the election of Sergei Aksinov, aka Goblin, new president of the Crimea. This fellow, according to Michael Totten, was with the Crimean post-Soviet Russian mafia in the 1990s. They never go away. They just advance in ranks. What is the modus operandi of the anti-Maidan demonstrations? Well, they are partly spontaneous. The people really got mad. Hey, we voted for that dude, Yanukovych. What did they get off kicking him out? We like him. He's one of our boys. Also, what? They liquidated that law which we liked that allowed us to speak Russian officially. They are fascists. I hate it. So I'm going to go demonstrate. Now, some of that was provoked by active measures of the secret services. You've just seen the woman. It's circumstantial evidence, but it's provoked, and partly it is organized from above. By whom? By the Party of Regions and people who are losers of Maidan. There is opposition to all of this. The opposition consists of Tatars, Ukrainian nationalists, both mainstream and extreme, some Russophone people who want to stay under Ukraine. For instance, in the Crimea, there is a little tiny village, used to be 12,000 people, maybe it has 6,000 people next to a Soviet naval base. It's called Novoozerne. The locals are Russian speakers, and they say, oh, we want to be in Europe, meaning we want to be under Ukraine. We don't want to go to Russia. And what the hell are those paramilitaries doing? Once the paramilitaries showed up, local people too, and some outsiders, then the Spetsnaz came in unmarked uniforms that neither Putin nor Lavrov acknowledges as theirs. And the locals say, you know, tourist season is coming. What the hell are they doing? We're by the sea. That's what we live on. We hope they go away. Well, yeah, I mean, but they are Russian speakers. They are Russian speakers. So there are very many sentiments. And the situation is quite fluid. Let me tell you very quickly, this will be the last thing, about the Russia factor. What is the objective? Well, the objective is between the Transnistrian, Abkhazian, South Ossetian option and the Kaliningrad solution for the Crimea. That's plan minimum. Plan maximum, of course, is the restoration of the Soviet Empire. That's obvious. It's been obvious forever. The Kremlin has deployed a whole array of the tools of statecraft, including propaganda. What's the best propaganda? Aside from Major Platt's cheat sheet, there is Ukraine is Russia, Crimea is Russia. That's the best propaganda. Because everybody knows what Russia is, and it's hard to pronounce Crimea in the West. Jews, neo-Nazis, and gays are behind Maidan. Mr. Stirna will show you. I'm not kidding. This is official propaganda. Here is a Cossack who is confused. On the left-hand side you have Adolf Hitler, Gay Day Parade, and Satan. On the right-hand side you have a little Soviet angel, or a Russian angel, Yuri Gagarin, the cosmonaut, the Rus boyars, or warriors, princes, and a Soviet tank, and an Orthodox church. This is in a nutshell. This, in a nutshell, is what's beamed at the people of Russia and Ukraine. Anyway, here's a little picture of territories annexed by Ukraine. Another topic of propaganda is exaggerating the extent of Ukrainian military defections. For instance, the Russian TV and press reported that Ukrainian warship Sahaydachny with NATO equipment on board hoisted a Russian flag, and it didn't. It was returning from a mission off of the coast of Africa, a joint mission with NATO, and it steamed into Odessa, not Sevastopol. But for about a week, the Russian TV and press boomed that there was a defection. So, to make everyone jittery. I'd like to read a quote from Russian Foreign Ministry of March 3rd. The West is now allying itself with unconcealed neo-Nazis who sack both Orthodox churches and synagogues. Okay. We will hear more of it. Fortunately, as I said, because of the Ukrainian government's responsibility, the situation has seriously de-escalated. For now. For now. What else? Active measures. Deception, intel operations, provocations. Screw the EU, and I'm censoring myself in these August walls, was leaked because an American diplomat was shocked to discover that someone would eavesdrop on her conversation. The post-Soviets, the Kremlin, has been mining the Snowden windfall to sow discord between NATO allies. Before Maidan, they were cherry-picking. Now there is a whole barrage of disinformation and real information, twisted, released by the Kremlin. And I like, the mechanism is always the same. They leak something, an obscure newspaper in Switzerland picks it up, and then Pravda splashes it over a front page, and the next day it's the New York Times. Yes, ladies and gentlemen. There have been numerous articles in the press by agents of influence and useful idiots. For instance, Dmitry Trenin in the New York Times on February 24th wrote a fantastic piece, Why Russia Won't Interfere. And then you had Ruslan Pukhov in the New York Times, March 4th. He's one of the pro-Kremlin Russian nationalist thinkers, head of a think tank in Moscow. And he gets a loudspeaker in the form of the New York Times. Even sometimes so-called experts like David Remnick, who should know better because he used to be a correspondent in the Soviet Union, refused to believe that Putin would intervene. And he went on CNN and other channels and said so. Now this is a good and kind person. Anyway, I'm not kidding. They're good and kind people. They simply cannot imagine that evil exists in the world. There are numerous social media operations, including YouTube posts that are anti-Maidan, sometimes manipulated, sometimes with a commentary, that is, they hijack postings by the pro-Maidan people and equip those posts with their own captions or narration. So there is a propaganda war going. And last but not least, some ugly stuff has come out. A few times, someone, unknown perpetrators, threw Molotov cocktails at synagogues. Who is it? Anti-Semite, ultranationalist? Possible. Were they provoked? Possible. That's a modus operandi of Russia's secret agencies. It has been for centuries now. Or maybe, ladies and gentlemen, the FSB. Because when there are no willing executioners, you supply them. Anything's possible. Moscow has also relied on diplomacy of force. The Kremlin fired an intercontinental ballistic missile as a test. The Kremlin puts the Baltic fleet on alert and orders it to stage exercises in Kaliningrad. That's a warning to Poland and Lithuania and to everybody else too. And Russia conducts military maneuvers along the border with Ukraine, but also in the Far East. So about 120 or 150,000 troops participated. Anyway, I could go on forever. This is just a brief overview, including actions within Ukraine and cyber warfare, as well as other tools of statecraft. But we must part. Thank you very much, and I hope you'll return soon. Question? Thank you very much. Perhaps you will be kind enough to ask me questions and also return my book. This is my only copy. Okay. Yes, sir.
Putin has gone on record as saying that Russia will send Russian-speaking people.
Yes.
Into which territories will they go?
Everywhere.
Baltic?
Estonia, absolutely. Latvia, Lithuania, everywhere. And since most in Belarus speak Russian, in Belarus too.
How about Poland?
How about Poland? There are some Belarusian speakers in Białystok and some Ukrainian speakers in Pomerania, as well as in Rzeszów region. If they qualify as Russians, Putin's heart is deep and it loves everyone.
Are there English-speaking peoples in these countries?
So we can defend them? Yes. 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 And they're not only expats. Go ahead.
So two well-known figures of American foreign policy have come out and basically recommended the Finlandization of Ukraine. You know who I'm referring to.
Yes.
What do you think
Including
about that?
Professor Brzezinski. I think the first person to float the idea was Foreign Minister Lavrov. He didn't say Finlandization, he said some kind of neutrality. Well, you know, it's the business of the Ukrainian people to decide what they want to do with themselves. If, however, I was a benevolent tyrant that I am, I would say it would be good to have the status quo ante, meaning Ukraine integrating with Europe and trading as much as possible with Russia, so Russia could relax and everybody could benefit. But that's too rational, you see. I understand that extending NATO to Ukraine and Georgia will be viewed as a provocation by Russia, except Georgia is not going to absorb Russia anytime soon. Nor is Armenia. And why is everybody paranoid there? Is because the Kremlin would like to reintegrate the empire. That's why they are paranoid. And I know we don't like that because we really do not like to be involved and pull someone else's chestnuts out of the fire, and it's usually left to the American leadership. When the wars broke out in the Balkans, the Euros couldn't do anything until the United States stepped in, for better and worse. Are we going to abdicate the leadership of the world? We can, and then we don't have to be involved. But you know, history never sleeps. Therefore, something will come to us. If it's not us, it's not going to be Pax Sinica. They're only strong enough for the region. If nobody is in charge, then there is chaos. I know that Russian anarchist theorist thinks that chaos is mать порядка, meaning anarchy is the mother of order, but I'd rather not experiment. So, can we be Pat Buchanan, neo-isolationist? Sure we can. Look what happened when the US got offended in 1918. General John Pershing said, we take Berlin or the Germans will not know that they lost the war. Liberals with David Lloyd George said, oh my God, let's just stop the war and embrace each other. So, very soon, America got mad, withdrew. And World War I continued with Adolf Hitler. We could have ended the whole thing had the powers that be listened to the American way of war, which is the total annihilation of the enemy. That doesn't mean extermination of the people, it's breaking the enemy's will to resist. It worked then. It'll work in the future. Americans don't like to fight political wars. Anyway, yes, sir.
How much of a deterrent do you think NATO is? And how much effect do you think
NATO is at best a shadow of its former self. The Poles got jittery and they invoked Article 4. Everybody in the West shrugged his shoulders. That's because there's no specter of Russian tanks visiting Rome or Paris. Paris has a very nice contract with...
So you're seeing the eastern states as being expendable? Even with
Yeah.
NATO?
Oh yes.
Even with the NATO?
Yes, even with NATO, the Poles were told basically that, even Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote an article, said that, well, for a month the Poles would have to fend off for themselves. Good luck. And Chuck Hagel said, oh, we're going to have maneuvers, air maneuvers. So 3 planes will fly this way and 4 planes the other. That's really going to intimidate the Kremlin. Either do nothing or do something serious. Madam, yes.
So what do you think is the next step of Putin and how long it will take him to go forward?
Well, you know, he could have taken Tbilisi and he stopped. I don't think he's ready. However, the logic of imperial expansion is oftentimes a crime of opportunity. So he may not stop. The Prince Gorchakov dispatched a very charming aristocratic officer and diplomat to London to assure the British during the so-called Great Game that Russia was not interested in grabbing any more of Central Asia. However, a local general decided to take Bukhara. The Tsar had agreed with the Prince Gorchakov, but once the general sent a report, the Tsar was happy. And the very charming diplomat, what was caught red-faced, he didn't even know that. He had no idea that different things occurred. So anything can happen, including incorporation of Ukraine. But then we would have a lot of terrorism, as Western Ukrainians will not know. Ukrainians will not reconcile themselves with this. Madam.
This is the last question.
Okay.
A couple of days ago, President Obama made a very strong point about saying, all right, we're going to have the economic sanctions. And suddenly, everyone, and when I say everyone, European nations, Britain, Germany, France, every place where there were significant Russian deposits of money, everybody sort of said, well, I don't know if that's what we really want to do, because the banks and everybody sort of backed away from that.
There will be symbolic sanctions. Putin recognizes it. He says, you would like to do anything against us? Remember, the world is global and interconnected. That's something that the liberal elite in the world understands very well. So there will be some chest thumping. I received several questions, not good-natured, about American foreign policy from Al Jazeera. And I responded very strongly that we are just posturing. Because the thing is, what would the Ukrainian people like us to do? To go to war for them? Yes, but if we stand firm, it's a different story. that helps the little ones in the world if America stands for law and order. And obviously international law has been violated. There's no doubt about it. In the Crimea, the new parliament, the new president, underground codename Goblin, wants to hold a referendum in 10 days. That's completely illegal. Why don't we invade Mexico and draft their citizens into our military and see what happens? Just a little bit of Mexico, just to draft a few thousand. Would that be a violation of, and have a referendum? Ship in our special forces who would be eligible to vote too. I'm sorry to say, but that's what the liberal Weimar Republic, liberal nationalist government used to do in Silesia during the plebiscites. They would ship in Germans to beef up the number of voting population. And some regions went to Germany, other regions went to Poland of Silesia. So, last question. I think there was a gentleman with a forlorn face, long face.
If the Russians do any more of an incursion into the Ukraine, do you think that the Ukrainians will cut off the pipeline?
This is very interesting because the energy weapon has not been used. The only thing Putin has done so far is said, yo, you owed me $1.5 billion. Do you think you could start paying? And the Minister of Energy said, well, we would like to pay, but we do not know when. So the energy weapon is looming over everyone, but it hasn't been deployed. You see, Putin hasn't gone all the way. Even if you look at cyber, if the level of cyber warfare, unknown perpetrators, and I think it's the Kremlin youth movement, Nashi, have attacked the Ukrainian government's main website and disabled it for a while. But not really that maliciously. Just for a while, for a day, a couple of days. Secondly, the Russian troops in the Crimea hooked up to the telecommunications grid, and they've been blocking cell phones of Ukrainian parliamentarians. I think 2 days or 3 days in a row. I don't know if this is still the case, but it's not really severe cyber attack like against Estonia when the whole country was paralyzed, or against Georgia, which for the first time in history the cyber attack was in conjunction with kinetic operations of the post-Red Army. I can also tell you that for the first time in history, that Bozo outfit Anonymous, together with the neo-Banderovцы or nationalist Ukrainian hackers, attacked Russia Today and smeared it and took parts of it down. That's a very important website. I'm so sorry for Anonymous. I can only tell you a story from the 1970s in Lebanon when Islamic terrorists kidnapped 2 Russian diplomats, the Soviet diplomats. Then their families were kidnapped and returned in suitcases. So the Islamist terrorists apologized, returned the Soviet diplomats, and nothing ever happened to the Soviet diplomats, ever. So if Putin gets mad at Anonymous, Anonymous will no longer be anonymous. Not only will it feel the sting of a virus, but also burly men in black will come with baseball bats to rearrange the anonymous offices. Anonymously, I might add. But you can count on that. In other words, no escalation. No escalation. Does it mean we should all sit down and relax and smoke a cigar? No. Absolutely no. There are very many diplomatic things, etc., that can be done. I have a whole laundry list. I won't tell you because Dr. Mastrapa wants to get rid of me. Anonymously. Not so anonymously. She's not ashamed. She's just brazen about it. Anyway, thank you very much. See you later. And thank